The night my son-in-law decided I didn't deserve a seat at his table, I was already sitting in it. I want you to picture the scene before I tell you what happened, because the picture matters. A long mahogany table set for 12. Crystal glasses catching the light from a chandelier that cost more than my first house. My daughter, Claire, at one end, glowing the way brides turned wives glow when they think their life has finally arrived. And me, 61 years old, in a plain gray cardigan, sitting quietly near the middle, because that is where mothers get placed when nobody thinks to ask them where they'd like to sit. Marcus, my son-in-law, was 3 drinks in and telling a story about his company's newest acquisition. Real estate holding groups, he said, were circling like vultures, and one of them had just outbid him on a downtown property he'd wanted for 2 years. He laughed about it, called the buyer some faceless shell company with more money than sense, and raised his glass like the joke was already funny enough to toast. Then his eyes drifted to me. I don't know why. Maybe I looked too comfortable. Maybe I wasn't laughing at the right moment. But he tilted his glass toward me and said, loud enough for the whole table to hear, "You know, Deanne, it must be nice to just show up to things and not have to worry about any of this. Must be nice to never have built anything." The table went quiet in that specific way tables go quiet when everyone senses a line has been quiet, and any other quiet has been quiet. My other daughter, Emma, who'd flown in from Chicago for the weekend, looked at me like she wasn't sure whether to defend me or wait and see what I'd do. And Marcus just kept smiling, waiting for me to either laugh it off or shrink, because that's what he expected. He'd expected it for 3 years. Since the wedding, he'd treated me like a woman who existed to babysit his children and admire his success from a respectful distance. I did neither. I smiled, took a sip of wine, and said, It's a rare gift, Marcus, watching men your age discover the difference between owning something and understanding it." He laughed, the kind of laugh people use when they didn't quite catch the insult, but no one happened. Claire kicked me gently under the table, the way she used to when I embarrassed her at school functions decades ago. I let it go. The night moved on. Dessert came. Marcus told another story about margins and leverage and how his firm was finally big enough to play with the real players. I nodded along, because I have spent 30 years learning that the most dangerous thing a woman can do in rooms like that one is correct a man who is enjoying the sound of his own voice. What Marcus didn't know, what none of them knew, except my late husband and my lawyer and a very small, very quiet circle of people who valued my privacy as much as I did, was that I hadn't simply shown up to things for the last 22 years. I had built something. I had built it slowly, deliberately, and almost entirely without a name attached to it, because I learned very early in my career that a woman's ideas travel faster and land safer when nobody knows whose ideas they are. After my husband died, I inherited a modest inheritance and a strange, stubborn belief that I understood real estate better than the men who'd spent their whole careers explaining it to me. I started small, a duplex here, a strip mall there. I made mistakes that cost me sleep and money I couldn't afford to lose. But I also made decisions nobody else was willing to make, because nobody else was willing to be patient the way I was. Over 2 decades, that patience became a portfolio. That portfolio became a holding company. And that holding company became something large enough that I stopped attaching my name to it entirely, because once people know a fortune belongs to a widow in a gray cardigan, they start asking her for things instead of asking her opinion. I called it Houston Vale Partners. Nobody at that dinner table had ever heard the name, and I intended to keep it that way. 3 weeks after that dinner, my phone rang at 7 in the morning. It was my acquisitions director, a sharp young woman named Renata, who had never once asked me a question I couldn't answer. She told me Houston Vale had closed on a distressed commercial portfolio downtown, 6 buildings, one of them mid-construction, all of it owned by a firm that had over-leveraged itself trying to compete with bigger players. The firm's name stopped me cold. Marcus's company. I sat with that information for a long moment, turning it over the way you turn over a stone you're not sure you want to look under. Then I asked Renata one question. Did the deal include operational oversight, or just the assets? Oversight, she said. Full oversight until the existing management team either proved themselves or was replaced. I told her I'd be attending the transition meeting myself. I could have sent someone. I have people whose entire job is to sit in rooms like that one, so I never have to. But I thought about the way Marcus had lifted his glass at me. The way he'd said never built anything like it was an established fact, rather than an assumption he'd never bothered to question. I thought about every dinner where he'd explained investment terms to me slowly, the way you explain things to a child, while I nodded and said nothing and let him believe he was teaching me. I decided I wanted to watch his face when the truth walked into the room. The meeting was set for a Tuesday morning in the same downtown office where Marcus had built his little empire. I arrived 20 minutes early, in a charcoal suit instead of a cardigan, my hair pulled back the way it used to be when I sat across boardroom tables from men who assumed I was somebody's assistant. Renata walked beside me, along with 2 members of our legal team. Nobody in that building knew my face. That was the point. We were led into a glass-walled conference room, where 6 of Marcus's senior staff were already seated, nervous in the particular way people get nervous when they know their jobs are being decided in a room they weren't invited to help design. Marcus arrived 4 minutes late, blazer half-buttoned, phone in hand, already talking before he'd fully sat down. "I appreciate everyone making time for this," he said, not looking up. "I know the transition period can feel uncertain, but I want to assure the new ownership group that this team has the expertise to—" He stopped. He'd finally looked up, and he was looking at me. I watched something complicated happen on his face. The specific, visible collapse of a story a man has been telling himself for years. Confusion first, then disbelief, then the horrible, dawning arithmetic of understanding exactly what new ownership group meant and exactly whose name was on the paperwork that had just taken control of everything he'd built his identity around. "Diane," he said, and his voice had lost every ounce of the confidence it carried at dinner tables. "What? I don't understand. Are you here with someone?" "I'm here as the principal of Houston Vale Partners," I said, and I let the silence sit for exactly as long as it needed to. "We closed on your portfolio 11 days ago. I believe you received the paperwork." The room did not breathe. Renata slid a folder across the table toward him, unhurried, professional, the way you'd hand someone a document that had already decided their fate before they touched it. Marcus stared at it like it might be a trick. Then he opened it, and I watched his eyes move down the page until they landed on the signature line, on the name that had been sitting across from him at family dinners for 3 years while he explained profit margins to it as though it had never once balanced a spreadsheet in its life. "This is—" he started, and then stopped, because there was no sentence that fit what he was feeling. "Diane Houston Whitfield," I said, quietly. "Houston is my maiden name. I kept it separate from everything personal a long time ago, for reasons that I think are becoming clearer to you right now." One of his senior staff members, a man named Curtis who had always been kind to me at the 2 office events I'd attended over the years, let out a small, disbelieving laugh and immediately tried to cover it with a cough. Marcus's jaw tightened. "You could have told me," he said, and there was something almost wounded in his voice, as if I owed him a warning before I became the person who now decided whether he kept his own company. "I did tell you," I said, "at dinner. You just weren't interested in the answer." I didn't gloat. I want to be clear about that because there is a version of this story where I stand up and deliver some grand, cutting speech about respect and assumptions, and I could have. Every word of it would have been earned. But I didn't need to say it, because the truth had already said it for me, sitting there in a folder on a conference table, in numbers that didn't care how loudly he'd laughed at dinner 3 weeks earlier. Instead, I did my job. We spent 2 hours going through the operational review. I asked pointed questions about the over-leveraged construction project, about decisions that had put the firm in the position it was now in, about whether the team believed the current strategy could be salvaged or whether it needed to be rebuilt from the studs. Marcus answered every question like a man trying to walk across ice that had already started cracking beneath him. To his credit, he didn't lie to me. He'd built something real, even if he'd built it recklessly, and some small part of me respected that he sat there and answered honestly, instead of trying to manage me the way he'd always tried to manage every room he walked into. At the end of the meeting, I told the team we'd be retaining most of the existing staff, restructuring the debt, and bringing in a new operational lead to steady the ship over the next 2 quarters. I did not say whether Marcus would be that lead, or whether he'd have any role at all, because I hadn't decided yet, and I wasn't going to decide it in front of an audience, simply because he'd once decided, in front of an audience, that I didn't deserve one. He caught me in the hallway afterward, when everyone else had filed out. "Does Claire know?" he asked. His voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it. "Not yet," I said. "That's your conversation to have, not mine. I think carefully about how you have it." "I said something stupid at dinner," he said. "It wasn't quite an apology. Men like Marcus rarely arrive at apologies directly. They circle them first, testing the ground." I corrected him. "That's different. And it's the part worth sitting with." I left him standing in that hallway, in the building he'd built and nearly lost, staring at a version of me he'd never bothered to imagine existed, and I walked out into a Tuesday morning that felt, for the first time in a long while, entirely and quietly mine. Emma called me first. Actually, before Claire even had the chance. My younger daughter has always had a sharper instinct for reading a room than her sister, and she'd apparently spent the entire dinner 3 weeks earlier watching my face instead of Marcus's, filing something away that she couldn't name at the time. "I knew it," she said, "the second I picked up. I don't know what it is exactly, but I knew there was an it. You get this look, Mom. This very specific look you get when someone underestimates you, and you've already decided you're not gonna correct them." "I don't have a look," I said. "You absolutely have a look. Dad used to call it your poker face, except it's not a poker face. It's a, this is going to be very expensive for you later face." She laughed. But there was real relief underneath it, the sound of a daughter who'd spent years worried her mother had shrunk herself down to fit inside other people's low expectations, only to discover the shrinking had been a choice all along. "So, Halston Vale, 22 years, Mom. 22 years and you never once said anything." I said things. I told her. I just didn't say them to people who were listening for the wrong things. She asked me, carefully, whether I was angry with Claire for marrying someone like Marcus in the first place. I told her the truth, that I wasn't angry at all, because Claire had married a man who was ambitious and occasionally careless with people, not a cruel one, and there was a difference worth protecting. Marcus's mistake wasn't marrying into a family he didn't understand. His mistake was deciding, the moment he met me, that there was nothing left to understand, and never once revisiting that decision in 3 years of dinners, holidays, and Sunday afternoons where I sat quietly and let him. "What happens now?" Emma asked. "Now I find out what kind of man he becomes when the ground shifts under him," I said. "Some men get smaller, some men get honest. I'm curious which one he'll turn out to be." Claire called me that night. I could hear in her voice that Marcus had told her everything, or at least the parts he could bring himself to say. She didn't ask me why I'd kept it from them. She asked me something better. She asked me to tell her the whole story from the beginning, the real one, not the version where her mother was just a woman in a cardigan who showed up to dinners and never built anything. I told her all of it. Every duplex, every mistake, every year I spent building something in silence, because silence, for a woman like me, had always been safer than being seen. She listened for almost